Thank you very much for this wonderful panel, and it naturally leads on to some of the key points I'm going to make in my keynote on deep tech startups, finance in Europe. So the present situation that we find ourselves in is clearly a recession. We have a big tech sell-off in biotech it can be as much as 90%. There is great uncertainty in the market still, not just because of the recession in technology, but of course the war in the Ukraine and the ongoing climate crisis. The IPO window is closed. Many tech companies have unsustainably high valuations and cash burns, and there is a SPAC hangover. So there are lots of bad news at the moment. But there is also good news. For the first time in history, European venture capital is giving better returns than US venture capital. The down cycles, if you do the analysis, and I'm old enough to have lived through 3 of these down cycles, these down cycles are actually the best time to start a new company, or indeed a new VC fund. There is still a lot of VC money around, which has been raised recently because the excitement about technology was such that these funds could be raised. The European Innovation Council, which I'll be talking about a little more in later slides, has 10 billion euros and is by far the largest deep tech venture fund in the world, and the only venture fund in the world who can also give grants. So it's a very unusual situation. We finally have a European technology culture that is getting closer to the US technology culture. And of course, AI, machine learning, blockchain and smart contracts, quantum computers, and synthetic biologies are new technologies that can create a whole new wave of new investments, new companies that will have a major impact on our economy. Against the background of all this, technology sovereignty, as we've just heard in the previous panel, has become an iconic issue for this decade. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Starting off with the question, what is technology sovereignty? Often this is mistaken to be an initiative which I very much support, that is anti-globalization, that is against China or even the US. It's got to be understood as an initiative that a number of areas in the world take to make sure that they've got access to all the critical technologies. Now, what does the critical technology mean? A critical technology is really one that you absolutely have to have in order to govern a country and to allow an independent economy. And we've got to understand that many technologies are not critical. So it does not mean that we should not take Chinese or American money as Europeans. It does not mean that some of the companies shouldn't be allowed to be sold to the Americans or the Chinese. But the main crux of the matter is an asymmetric relationship between countries, where one country can exert a lot of economic coercion on another one. And I'll go through a few examples. And of course, since we've got the semiconductor industry as a focus area for this conference, I will make a few comments on semiconductors, of course, which clearly is one of those critical technologies, together with the 5G network, because if you took, I think, smartphones and 5G connectivity away from especially our young people, they will not feel that the nation is looking after them very well. I already mentioned that AI and machine learning, of course, has become such a critical technology. The new ones, which I'm particularly excited about, is synthetic biology, which probably will revolutionize the way we think about our healthcare system, because after the DNA sequencing that has produced enormous data sets, DNA synthesis will allow us to create new life forms and to change existing life forms through cell reprogramming and a number of new techniques. And also the blockchain and smart contracts, especially when used as a central bank digital currency, can have a major effect on our nations. So the pandemic over the last 2 years has really produced two wake-up calls for Europe. One, it has made clear how dependent we are on China for manufacturing. This was clear for the masks and PPE. We didn't realize that we couldn't actually produce enough masks and personal protection equipment to cope with the pandemic, because all the manufacture was done in China. But this is just one example of many where the asymmetry in our manufacturing capabilities has become a technology sovereignty issue. And the second, on the other side of the world, was Trump, who, to our total amazement, weaponized US technology and used that weapon not just against China, but against his own longtime allies in Europe. So this economic coercion that is the result of these technology dependencies that have appeared because asymmetries have appeared in some technologies between different countries. This economic coercion is now as serious dependence as military coercion of yesteryear. So Europe really needs a 100 billion technology sovereignty fund to have the equivalent amount of money to the Americans that are using 100 billion for their technology sovereignty, and the Chinese, who actually have even more money to spend on technology sovereignty, in particular on semiconductors, as we will see in a moment. So given this new situation, the technology sovereignty has really almost replaced military sovereignty, although the unexpected war in the UK is a sort of throwback to the bad old days where guns were actually the final arbiter of who influences a country. But let's hope that this will continue to diminish as it has over the last 100 years, and that it is really a technology that is a more invidious way of exerting coercion on another country. So every nation now has to ask themselves three critical questions. The first question is, do we have the technology ourselves? Now, clearly, if we do, everything in the garden is rosy and we're done. However, it is clear that none of the nations, including the US, when it comes to the most advanced semiconductor technology, for example, which can only be produced by TSMC and Samsung at the moment, one factory which is in Taiwan and the other one which is in Korea, none of them are in either the US, China, or Europe. So then we've got to ask the question, if we don't have it ourselves, do we have access to the critical technology from multiple independent countries so that no single country can use this to coerce us to do things that we don't want to do? And if the answer to the second question is no as well, then we've got to pose the third question, which is, do we have unfettered, long-term, that's more than 5 years, guaranteed access to it from a monopoly or oligopoly supplier of a single country, of course, typically China or the US? If all three questions are answered with a no, then we have to do whatever it takes to ensure that yes is the answer to at least one of the three questions. Because if we don't, we've got to accept that we become dependent on another state and get exposed to economic coercion, which is just as serious as military coercion in the past. And this is really a very serious matter. Thinking a lot about this subject over the last few years and writing a book on technology sovereignty, I've come to the conclusion that there are really only three technology sovereignty circles in the world that have a chance of having all the critical technologies that are needed and therefore have sovereignty in the sense of being independent from other states and capable of making our own independent decisions rather than being exposed to these asymmetric dependencies, typically to the US or China. And these three, of course, are the US, China, and Europe. But out of the three, there are two hegemons. And Europe is the only one that is not a hegemon, because the US will ask, are you with us or are you against us? And if you say, I am with you, then the next sentence is, okay, now you do exactly what I tell you to. And China, of course, is no better, arguably a lot worse with the Belt and Road Initiative that tries to dominate, especially the Asian states, by making them economically dependent on China. Europe is the only one of the three that doesn't ask, are you with us or are you against us? But they asked, do you share our values? The reason why I know this is that I spend a lot of my time in New Zealand, and I'm keen for New Zealand to join Horizon Europe. So I asked my friends in Brussels, would it be possible for New Zealand to join Horizon Europe, which is our 100 billion research initiative in Europe? And the answer was, well, New Zealand does not score very high on geographic proximity, but that's not the question we ask. The question we ask is, do you share our values? And neither New Zealand, Australia, nor Canada has any problems with sharing European values, because they're very much countries that have appeared from a European value scale. And therefore, all three of these countries are now applying to become a part of Horizon Europe. So Europe really is the only, and I'm a passionate European, as you probably know, and was very upset about Brexit because I'm also a passionate Anglophile, so it was a bit like my parents divorced with Brexit. And I'm always trying to get them back together again, and we'll see whether we're making any progress with that. One of the things that I'm so proud of as a passionate European is that Europe is really the only area in the world that has a governance layer above the nation state, which sort of works and has shown a number of spectacular successes, notably, of course, with the euro and being the largest free trade area in the world. But it has done so by accepting national differences. It has a history of accepting that the French are different from the Germans, are different from the Italians. And although we lost Britain, which is, of course, a very sad thing, there was also the acceptance that Britain, of course, is different and should be part of Europe. And maybe one of the only positive aspects that I can derive from the Brexit event is that Britain wanting to leave did not result in war. Painful as it was a democratic process. So again, this is a reflection of the maturity, of the democratic maturity of Europe. That, if countries want to leave, they can. And we now have a very sad, but an actual example of that, didn't go very smoothly, but didn't result in a war either. And this makes Europe clearly the best choice for any of the independent nations. And we should not forget that the independent states, which will have to make a decision on which of the three technology sovereignty circles to join in order to have the security of all the critical technologies, that would make Europe really the easiest one to join. So out of those three, the US, China, and Europe, why is Europe the one to choose from if you're not one of the three already? It's not because we've produced the Colosseum in the past and we've got a phenomenal past, because so does China, but because we also have high-tech parks like this one here in Cambridge that is willing to connect with the future, not just with the past. And we're very keen to become independent, for example, also in the semiconductor space. It is not just the US that has passed a CHIPS Act of $50 billion to rejoin and become a major producer of semiconductors. Europe also has a 50 billion euro initiative in semiconductors. And semiconductors is a particularly interesting case because neither the US nor China nor Europe actually has factories that can produce the state-of-the-art 5 nanometer and smaller semiconductors that we need for sovereignty in the semiconductor space, because there are only two factories that can do this at the moment. One is TSMC, the Taiwanese Semiconductor Corporation in Taiwan, that produces about 70% of those chips, and the other is Samsung, which produces the rest. Intel, sadly, has stumbled and is incapable of producing 5 nanometer semiconductor chips at the moment. Now, both the US and Taiwan and Europe, of course, are very keen for state-of-the-art factories to be also be built in Europe. And we've got a $20 billion factory of TSMC going up in Phoenix in the US at the moment, and there are negotiations in Europe to have a similar initiative with TSMC in Europe, so that if there is a problem in Taiwan and China finally takes Taiwan, hopefully in a peaceful mission rather than in an aggressive takeover, then Europe and America are not exposed to coercion, to this asymmetric coercion from Taiwan being part of China. So I will now make a few comments on the EIC. I used to chair the advisory board of the EIC that came up with the rules, and now I'm vice chair of the EIC. And as I pointed out earlier, at 10 billion euros, albeit over a 7-year period between now and 2028, we will spend an average of 1.5 billion only in deep tech in Europe. And the EIC, the European Innovation Council, is also the only venture capital organization in the world that can give grants up to $2.5 million grants for deep tech companies, so as to sweeten the deal and crowd in the market. So one of the rules that I insisted on when we were writing the rules is that the EIC can only invest in a deep tech company in Europe if more than 50% of the money comes from the market, so as to crowd in the market rather than crowd out the market. And this has worked extremely well. So every euro that the European Innovation Council invests in deep technology startups in Europe is now accompanied by 3 euros that come from the market. Which means that it's actually not 10 billion, it's closer to 30 billion that we're going to spend on deep technology in Europe over the next 7 years. It is developing extremely fast. In our first pilot year, we've spent over 600 million euros in deep tech companies, in 160 deep tech companies in Europe, and we have got another 180 companies now that have applied that we hope to make decisions on after a delay because we changed the administration of the EIC, but we hope to clear up the backlog of 160 companies by the end of the year. And I think it will make a major contribution to venture capital in Europe, which is lagging so far behind the US, because although the US and Europe are comparable in size and have universities that are comparable in their output, there is only a quarter of the venture capital in Europe available for European startups compared with the US. So I'm writing a book on technology sovereignty because this issue has exercised me a lot, partially because of Trump's behavior in the semiconductor industry, which also affected Arm, a British company which provides many microprocessors for smartphones and embedded control worldwide, and now also in the data center. And the reason why I'm so exercised about technology sovereignty is I think that there is a real fear of technology colonialism if we're not careful. And we must make critical technologies available to all nations in the world on non-coercive terms. I'm wondering whether critical technologies actually ought to become a human right. And I'll be writing about that. It's also a chance for Europe, together with Britain, to lead, because China and the US together are only 1.8 billion out of 8 billion. So if Europe can create a technology circle that is attractive to the rest of the nations, we will be the only one of the three technology circles that has a chance of scaling because it is not a hegemonic approach. The strategic importance of computers as another critical technology, of course, is clear. We need more performance. Data has become the new steel and coal of the Industrial Revolution. And it really needs this extra computer power in order to build better models for better decision making. And quantum computing, to pick just one example, can solve problems that classical computers cannot solve. This has to do with the fact that qubits, these quantum bits, scale exponentially with the number of computers, so with the number of qubits. So the performance of a quantum computer goes up exponentially with the number of qubits in the computer, compared with a classical computer where the performance rises linearly with the bits. Quantum computers are expected to make major contributions to healthcare and drug development in the future. Long term, one could envisage drug trials in silico. It can revolutionize the way we do financial models, and there is the big danger that Shor's algorithm can crack the RSA 2048 encryption code that we're using for 95% of everything that we encrypt nowadays. It's important to add that although Shor's algorithm and quantum computers will be able to crack the RSA code, it is a quantum key distribution which will be the first completely secure way of transmitting innovation. It's the only way of actually provably secure transmission, because it depends on the Heisenberg relationship, one of the fundamental laws of physics. But there is a race going on in quantum computing, again, between the US, China, and Europe. And we, again, have university groups that are just as good as the American and the Chinese ones. But American quantum computing startups like PsiQuantum or IonQ have managed to raise 700 or 600 million respectively. The best funded European startup is IQM with 200 million. And China, of course, puts even more money into quantum computing and the semiconductor industry. The quantum computing architecture is wide open at the moment. So there's every reason to believe that Europe can win that race, or at least have leading companies in this space, just as the US and China. The leading technology is based on superconducting qubits, taking advantage of two quantum phenomenon. In fact, all of these architectures take advantage of superposition and entanglement as the reason for why quantum computers are so much better than classical computers. And the candidates, which are completely different technologies, it must be said, are superconducting magnetic flux qubits, ion traps, cold atoms, and photonic qubits. There is then an error correction layer on top of these qubits, which is a much harder problem to solve in quantum computing than in classical computing. And we actually have an Austrian company called Parity QC that has ARM-like features in the sense that it's the only quantum computer company that is a quantum architecture company. And it has just won the biggest single order of a quantum computer from the DLR, the Deutsche Luft- und Raumfahrtgesellschaft, for 200 million euros in a consortium with NXP and Electron. The interesting thing is that 100 logical qubits, for which we've got a race on at the moment, 100 logical qubits is enough to solve problems that no classical computer can solve. Synthetic biology is another one of these key new technologies that will make biology something that we can actually influence ourselves. And Richard Feynman famously said that I cannot understand what I cannot build. And gene synthesis, which is now becoming a reality, will allow us to build life, which we've never been able to do before. And we now have a good enough model of all the basic building blocks of life so that this is possible and has actually been shown. New life forms, new bacteria have been completely synthesized. This will revolutionize healthcare as we know it through regenerative medicine and also cell therapy. And there is the slightly esoteric opportunity of having a DNA computer, which uses maybe 10 to the 19 parallel processes using DNA and CRISPR to solve 3-SAT problems, which is an NP-complete problem, and could be even more powerful than quantum computers, and solve the traveling salesman problem, for example, and graph isomorphism. This is still very early days, but there is an interesting comparison with Fugato, which at the moment is the most powerful computer in the world, with 10 to the 11 MIPS. But the DNA laptop could actually be even more powerful than that. So in conclusion, European technology venture capital has come of age, giving better returns than the US venture capital industry for the first time in history. Technology sovereignty is an iconic issue of the decade, which we need to confront and work on. And in particular, as you will hear later on in the conference, brings the semiconductor capability back to Europe. We now have about 10% market share in semiconductors. By the way, the US has 12%, so not much better. But we used to have 20% each, and we need to get these factories back into Europe. Deep tech will have new technologies that every nation needs, and deep tech needs to cover new technologies that appear all the time as it goes. There is a race on between the US, China, and Europe to create complete technology sovereignty circles, and Europe will provide the only technology sovereignty solution which is not hegemonic and therefore scalable. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Hermann. Excellent insights, and we also have a lot of questions from our audience. Keep posting the questions on your right-hand side. You have a chat section and Slido integration, so please feel free to ask us more questions. We have 15 more minutes time with Hermann, then you have to run to your next meeting, and we're very grateful for your time. Maybe, Yasmin, I will start with the first question, which is upvoted. The person would like to repeat the question from the previous panel. What role should European universities play for technological sovereignty?
Well, they're an absolutely critical component of technology sovereignty, and it is actually the strength of European university system, which is on a par with the US university system, and also on a par with a very rapidly riding Chinese university system. So we still have the brains in Europe, and the research groups. Quantum computing is a classic example. Innsbruck, of all places, has 2 world-class quantum computer groups, and has just won a Nobel Prize with Anton Zeilinger, who actually did a lot of his work at Innsbruck before he came to Vienna. So if we didn't have this bedrock of university research results, we would have no chance of becoming technology sovereign. But we need to avail ourselves of that strength in European universities to translate these results into successful startups, spin-outs that can eventually contribute to the technology sovereignty in Europe.
Yeah, I'm also taking a question from the Slido chat that interests me as well, because you're saying there will be these 3 big sovereignty cycles. What kind of information did you use to come to this conclusion? I make an example. I mean, you could also say that, for example, Australia works with New Zealand, with Japan, maybe Britain. I mean, they could form their own circle. They have resources, they have water, they have energy. What hinders them from becoming as big as Europe?
Well, the definition of technological sovereignty that I've given in my talk is that you have to have all the critical technologies. It's not good enough to just have 1 or 2. You have to have all of them so that there isn't an asymmetry with another country, so that another country can force you to do things that you don't want to do by withholding the technology, as Trump, for example, has done with chip design software, because Synopsys and Cadence are 2 American companies that have a 90% market share in chip design software. And Trump has managed to use that to coerce not just China, but European companies to do what he wanted them to do. So, but Europe is really, outside the US and China, is really the only area that is big enough, both economically and in terms of the quality of the university research, to be an effective technology sovereignty circle with all the critical technologies.
Maybe a quick follow-up question to this. How realistic is it to increase the tech sovereignty budget to 100 billion? Do you have any insights on that?
Yes. We've made an excellent start, of course, with the 50 billion for the semiconductor industry. And we've got another 10 billion with the European Innovation Council. And if the 1-to-3 ratio of market dollars to EIC dollars holds up, so we've got another 30 billion there, so 50 plus 30 is 80, so we might be able to get there.
Perfect. And just to double down on, because I think you're making such an important point, and the question underlines it maybe again. It says that in like climate change, lack of water, lack of energy, lack of other resources that we have, do you see the dependencies on the technological level on the same level with all the other dependencies?
Well, climate change, of course, is a classic example where many of the solutions to climate change are actually technical solutions, be it in using advanced AI techniques to use energy more efficiently than we have in the past. But also, we're finally, if you take a longer term view, we're finally making tremendous progress with fusion. And atomic fusion is one of the long-term solutions to climate change because it's CO2. It doesn't create any CO2, and it doesn't create atomic waste as fission does, the existing atomic source of energy. And many of the other technologies, be it new solar cells, new ways of storing energy, because one of the big remaining problems for alternative energy, be it solar or wind, is what do you do when the wind doesn't blow, or what do you do at night when the sun doesn't shine? You need to have a storage capability. And hydrogen, a new hydrogen economy, and a lot of investment and a lot of clever research is going into the hydrogen economy, may be one of the solutions to the storage problem, for example.
And now I found the second part of the question, it bumped. So, because this also means that, like in the other dependencies, that we need to abstain the comfort that we are having at the moment in order to reach the sovereignty. So you think that we'll have to do that as well?
No, I'm not a believer that we've got to go back to, freezing in the and not turning on our heating at all. Although reducing your temperature at home by just 1 degree does make a lot of difference to your energy consumption at home. I do believe that it will be possible to continue growing. Some people believe that growth is bad. We should not continue to increase our living standards because that will ruin the planet. I do believe that with new technologies we can have both. We can have growth in the economy, we can have a better quality of life, and we can do so by being more efficient and not harming the environment. So we can solve the climate problem at the same time as continuing to grow.
Hermann, what are actually the early effects of the European Chips Act at the moment? I mean, where is the money invested? Is this France? Is this Belgium? Is this Germany? Where will the new tech hubs be? Right across Europe, but probably the most famous announcement has been the 7 billion euros that have gone into the Intel semiconductor fab in Magdeburg. But there are there's recently been another announcement of Infineon spending 7 billion again in the Eastern Germany. There is an initiative in France. So as a result of the CHIPS Act, these factories are being built at quite a clip now. This is a surprisingly speedy decision and then implementation, given that semiconductor factories take years to build.
One question from the university. From research to product, it's a long and risky path. Universities take all the risks and do the hard job for the investors. How can you encourage us to continue doing this?
Right. Well, if you look at the amount of effort and the amount of money that it takes for a technology to really become effective in the industry, then the amount of effort, the amount of work that goes on in a university, if that was a unit 1, then developing it into a product or a service that actually is appropriate for market is a unit 10. And then to actually roll it out in a major way is a factor of 100. So in a way, you've got to think about the contribution of the university to be about 1% of what it actually takes to make a technology universal. So the universities shouldn't get too uppity about their contribution. Of course, it wouldn't happen without having the breakthroughs in the first place. So if you didn't have the 1%, you had nothing. But in order to make it really effective, universities ought to accept that actually the major work then needs to be done in the economy to make a technology ubiquitous for our nation. And that's why it's so important for universities to understand that they actually have 3 jobs, not just one. And the 3 jobs, the 3 missions of a university are, of course, educating the next generation of students. Secondly, the research that results in these phenomenal results that we're producing. But thirdly, to contribute to actually translating these research results for the benefit of the nation, because it's the nation that actually provides the money for the universities to do the research in the first place.
One question on the GDPR. AI development is quite dependent on data availability. How does GDPR and data protection affect AI development and technological sovereignty?
I think it's one of those very positive examples for Europe. Europe has always had a strength in setting standards, and GDPR is no exception. There are a number of nations around the world now that have adopted GDPR. Most of California has, surprisingly, in the US. So data is absolutely important, and it's sometimes called the new oil. But we also must protect it in the way that GDPR does. And it is perfectly possible to take advantage of these big data sets in a sensible way, using AI and machine learning to give the benefits, for example, in healthcare by using machine learning on genomes and health records in an anonymized way.
Yeah, maybe one last question from my side, because you have to run. We were talking a lot about semiconductors. It's also a main topic of this conference, but where are actually the biggest bottlenecks that Europe has at the moment with regard to sovereignty?
Well, semiconductors is probably the single, the biggest one right now, and the most pressing one. Fortunately, we have very good 5G technology with Ericsson and Nokia. So there are a number of bright stories about Europe as well. But then there are, technologies that are rather more old-fashioned, going right the way back to wheat. Who would have thought that wheat is going to be important until we didn't have access to wheat anymore from the Ukraine, or the old resources like oil and raw materials. So although you wouldn't normally think of it as technology sovereignty, it is still a key part of a European sovereignty issue.
This is probably a quick question. You mentioned the downturn in the markets and the recession that might be coming. Is it still a promising rationale for VC funds to invest in deep tech?
Absolutely, because during a recession, the reason why deep tech companies that get born during a recession are actually more successful than deep tech companies that start during the heydays of when everything goes well is quite simple. One is, during a recession, very good people become available because some of the very good companies, and at the moment, Amazon, Facebook, they're all shedding very good people that are becoming available. They're going to be recycled into new startups. So one of the positive aspects about recessions is that very highly talented people that you couldn't normally attract into a startup are becoming available, or they themselves might want to start a new company. And for the VCs, the valuations are more reasonable, and that's why VCs make better returns if they start during a recession. So recession is actually the best time to start your new deep tech company.
Maybe a final question. How optimistic are you? And you seem to be very optimistic on that question that we're going to make it as Europe to develop a circle of technological sovereignty.
I'm very confident. My confidence is based on the quality of our university system, on the realization finally at the political level that this is a very important issue, and the availability of money to invest in it with the European Innovation Council, with the CHIPS Act. So one of the advantages that we still have in Europe is we're actually quite rich. So we have the money. The problem in the past, and still at present, I would argue, is we actually have an asset allocation problem. The biggest risk in Europe is that we don't take enough risks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Hermann. There are a couple of questions still left there, but you have to run, and you have to run to a meeting of Austrian Council. And before you go, why is this important to you? Why do you invest your time in Austrian Council as well?
Well, I've been on the Council for Science and Technology in Great Britain for 10 years, and I'm delighted to be a part of the Forschungsrat at the moment because it addresses exactly these issues that we've been discussing here at this conference. We will actually have a Klausur today and tomorrow to go through many of the points that were made at the VC panel and in my keynote about technology sovereignty, about how Austria can have access to semiconductors. And indeed, one of the greatest factories we have in Europe is in Villach with Infineon that produces many of the key components for electric vehicles, for example. So we're no schmucks in Austria. We can make our contribution to this.